thank you all again for joining us today. We're really glad to have you with us, and I am so excited to have my colleague Barb Collura with MCI here today, as well as Laura MacDonald, who is the chair of the Giving USA Foundation and also the founder of the Benefactor Group. If you go to the next slide, you can see their beautiful faces in still, even though you can see their faces live on the screen as well. But they're going to talk today about giving trends and some really, really cool statistics and facts from national trends and how we can apply those to our organizations. So just some housekeeping before I turn it over to Laura. We are recording this session, as you probably were notified when you logged on. The recording will be sent to all of our registrants after the session is finished. Additionally, we want to hear from you. We want this to be interactive. So if you have questions or comments throughout the presentation, please feel free to put those in the chat and we will get to them throughout the presentation. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Laura MacDonald.
Great. Thanks, Emily. And I'm going to start by sharing some data that comes from an annual report that's done in the philanthropic sector. It's called Giving USA. It's a 400-page book, and I've got a slide for each page in the book. So I'm going to go through. No, I'm not going to do that. It is a rich resource, though. And after today's webinar, Emily will also be sending an email with a link if you would like to subscribe to Giving USA, and with a discount that will be available to those of you who participate today. So Giving USA is the foundation for a Giving Institute, which is a professional association also managed by MCI. And every year when we publish the annual report, our firm does a whimsical little one-page infographic that boils those 400 pages down to a whimsical broadside. And so that's what you'll be seeing in the visuals today. I'll say that each year we pick a theme. This year we paid homage to the mom and pop diners and the other small businesses that struggled in the course of the pandemic. So if you'd like a copy of that, I think my contact information, or go to our firm's website and we'd be happy to send a copy of that to you. But before we get started, I know Barb and I had some questions about the audience that we're talking today. So I think our first question is this: how many staff are devoted fully or partially to fundraising at your organization, to securing contributed revenue for your organization, in addition to any membership or earned revenue or the other kinds of things that you might do? And while we're waiting just a moment for a couple more responses to that, I will say that you'll see that we have a fairly small audience here today. I know that others have registered and will be getting the recording, but all the more reason why, if you've got questions, throw them into chat. Emily will pass them on to us, and let's make this a conversation rather than a long lecture of some sort. So as you can see, now most of you, and I'm not surprised by this, have comparatively small fundraising teams who are working on the contributed revenue for your organization. And all the more reason for you to understand this data and how you can use it to make your fundraising as efficient as possible, given that your resources to do this work are constrained. So you can see the results that most of you have just one person, a few have 2 or 3 people. So there you go. So with that, let me jump into the data and what it tells us. We know that in 2020, Americans donated $471 billion to nonprofit organizations. Just to put that in context, it's more than the total economy of developed nations like Scandinavian countries. So it's a lot. Americans are very generous in this regard. And despite all of the disruptions that we saw in 2020, charitable giving grew by 5.1%. From the $448 billion that was given in 2019. As we work with this data, and by the way, this report's been published for 66 years, so it's an amazing longitudinal data set. And as we worked on it in 2020, we realized that all of the things that happened, from a recession to a decline in the GDP to the stimulus and the provisions of the CARES Act, it's probably not a year that I would use to benchmark my charitable giving in a lot of ways. There are going to be a lot of asterisks for 2019 or your 2020 fiscal year, I think, as you move forward. The other thing I'll say about this data is that it's only one measure of generosity. There are many other ways in which households, corporations, and foundations demonstrate generosities. For example, a lot of people did crowdfunding campaigns on a platform like GoFundMe. We don't capture that unless it's given actually to a nonprofit organization. People were going to diners and leaving a huge tip for the underemployed service staff at that diner. And so we know that there are a lot of other things that measure bottom-up generosity, because more and more philanthropy, to its detriment, is becoming a sort of a top-down. Okay, so who gave all of that money? When we take a look at philanthropy, we continue to see that individual donors really drive charitable giving. That almost $325 billion of that came from individual donors making gifts out of their current resources. And that's traditionally been the case, that most philanthropy is given by individuals. And I know that when we work with boards, they're really comfortable talking about this foundation or that corporation. They tend to get less comfortable talking about individual donors, and yet really that's the most sustainable part of the fundraising process. Corporations were enormously generous in 2019, really leaning into both the disruptions caused by the pandemic and some of the calls for social justice that we saw. And we'll talk a little bit about the fact that corporations, yes, corporate pre-tax profits declined. Corporate giving declined by double that amount. So we'll talk a little bit about corporate giving, because I know many of you have logical connections with corporations. So when you hear that that's the sort of the pie chart of where charitable giving comes from, we have another question for you. For your organization, what percentage of your organization's revenue comes from contributions, charitable gifts? Is it less than 10%, 10 to 20, or more than 20%? You know, Barb, we were chatting a little bit earlier, and your organization is significantly driven by charitable contributions, I believe.
Well, we get about 35 to 40% of our overall revenue from charitable support. We're in that smaller organization size in the health space, and a lot of our colleagues in this small health space, it's about where it fits, because we get, you get a couple of pharmaceutical companies that support you, and that can make a big difference in that overall revenue when you're a smaller size. We're about a $2 million organization.
Gotcha. Yeah, and we see that for a lot, the landscape is very different. In arts and culture, for example, it may be that 60% of your revenue is contributed in, if you're a healthcare system, it may be that 2% of your revenue is contributed because of all of you're driving all of that earned revenue, same in many higher ed institutions. And it looks like we've got a variety of experiences amongst the people who are with us today, that some smaller, some bigger. And whatever it is, and I know for some organizations, if only a sliver of your revenues is contributed revenue, sometimes it's hard to make the case for investment in fundraising. But I think that, look not just at the total, but at the return on investment. We'll go back to that healthcare example where the margins for inpatient services might be minuscule. The margin in fundraising can be significant. Hopefully a mature fundraising program is getting to the point where they're spending less than 30 cents to raise $1. That's not going to be true of your earned revenue as well. So let's continue to drill into this a little bit. I mentioned this earlier. Giving by individuals grew $7 billion from 2019 to 2020, but Mackenzie Scott alone gave $5.6 billion. So we know that there's this continued influence of mega gifts in philanthropy. And one of the reasons for that is this disparate experience that different households have when it comes to the economy. Many people described the recovery that we had in 2020 as a K-shaped recovery, that those households that were working and employed, could work from home, had assets in the market, they recovered and recovered nicely. But some individuals, and some corporations had the opposite experience with the continued disruptions to the supply chain. I think we're seeing the news just today about a couple of things, that GDP growth has been diminished by the International Monetary Fund. They are saying now that growth for 2021 is going to be lower than we expected. So we see that, not all sectors, including not all members or donors, members of your organizations or donors, are having a similar experience. But where does all that money go? We at Giving USA really look at 7 different sectors that receive charitable gifts. Traditionally, religion has been the largest recipient of charitable gifts, although their slice of the pie has diminished over the years, from more than 50% when I started my career to today, less than a third. It's not that they're not growing, but they're not growing nearly as fast as some other sectors like education. I'll just unpack a couple of lines here. One is that you might be wondering, why in the world is it that in a year in which we had a global pandemic, giving to health declined by 3%? And I'll attribute that to two things. The first, and we're going to talk about this a little bit, is that many health-related charities use events like walks and rides and runs to raise money, and those were pretty constrained. Even those that were able to do some sort of a virtual version didn't raise as much as they did in their live versions previously. The other thing is that, I'll give you an example. When Dolly Parton gave $1 million to vaccine research, you would think that that would be counted as a gift to health, but she gave it to Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Almost all of that research was happening in academic healthcare, and so that gets counted as a gift to education, which is part of that growth that we see in education. But you can use this data to think about, what sector am I in? What are the motivations that are driving my donors? And what do these trends tell me about the direction that charitable giving might be going in my world? The other thing that we know, and I mentioned this earlier, that board members play a very important role in securing charitable gifts, making their own, asking others to give. And that's particularly true with gifts from individual donors. That, well, first of all, corporations and foundations are going to want to know that a significant proportion, hopefully 100% of your board members, give. And your board members are the ones that are going to bring to you connections to other individuals who could be making gifts as well. And we see a wide range of experiences with boards. Some have rock star boards. Looks like we've got some boards here who have gone beyond, the discomfort, but and are at least leading by example. It's not unusual that we don't have any fundraising rock stars in the crowd today. It's an area of discomfort for boards, and their ability to do this work and do it well needs to begin with the moment when you recruit them to your board, and they understand that by serving on our board, one of the things we're going to ask you to do is lead by example. So I'm happy to see that we have more responses in that lead by example than the discomfort. What can we do? And perhaps we can talk about this to move them into becoming advocates and maybe even rock stars. So thanks for answering that question. I know an organization like BoardSource does a survey like this every 3 years, and this pretty much reflects the kinds of responses that they get nationally when they ask the question. So I talked a little bit about the fact that giving to 5 of the 7 sectors grew in 2020, that, we saw in particular strong growth in education, strong growth in public and society benefit. And we'll talk a little bit about that in our discussion, I think, Barb, because that includes a couple of things. Certainly social justice organizations are included in that, things like voters' rights or defense funds, but also donor advised funds are included in that. We're going to talk about those. We did see, as I mentioned, the decline to health. That makes sense. Arts, culture, and humanities tends to decline when giving is disrupted. A lot of people turn their attention to food banks and homeless shelters. Giving to arts and culture declined 7.5%. In the Great Recession, it declined 17.5%. So if you're in that sector, do not fear, because it came back very quickly after the Great Recession as well. The other thing that we know is that the circumstances that we just saw really increased online giving. People flocked to online giving. So if you have not done an update in your online giving platform lately, I would encourage you to take a strong look at it, say, what can we do to make sure that our online giving portal is frictionless and that we've got a lot of gifts coming in through that opportunity. But I will say that online giving is one place where many people make their first gift. And I'm curious what all of you think. Nationally, when a donor makes a first gift to an organization like yours, what are the chances that they're ever going to make a second gift? 1 in 10, 1 in 5. We've got a few responses coming in. We'll wait for just a minute. And even though we've got a little bit of time left for people to answer, I'll go ahead and give away the punchline. Donor retention in general is an area of great concern when it comes to fundraising. Like any other business model, the more we can do to retain our existing donors, the more efficient our model will be. And retention rates have been dropping for several years, but in particular for first-time donors, the likelihood that they'll ever make a second gift is 1 in 5. Only 20% of first-time donors ever make a second gift to an organization. And it becomes compounded because when donors are inspired to give because of some sort of an emergency situation, a natural disaster, a global health pandemic, typically disaster donors, only 1 in 20 ever make a second gift. And we're thinking, the response to the pandemic and calls for social justice are going to fall somewhere in between. So I think something Barb and I will talk about is what we can all do to try to increase those retention rates, because it makes our sector less efficient. So just in closing, before we turn to the conversation, I'll talk a little bit about some of the factors that you might want to be looking out for that do affect charitable giving. The first is GDP. In 2020, giving was 2.3% of GDP. That's good news because typically it's been less than 2% or bumping right up around 2%. But it was a higher percentage in 2020 for bad reasons because GDP declined. We do have new data now that's talking about what the International Monetary Fund thinks GDP growth will be for 2021, and that may be influencing what we think, how bullish or bearish we are about charitable giving. We also see market growth. This particularly affects high net worth households and foundation giving. In 2020, the market grew 16%. After that swoon, and remember late March, early April of 2020, some pretty scary market declines, but it rebounded. What matters is year over year market performance. So even though the market has been pretty good for most of this year, more lately it's been a little bit anemic, and so you might want to keep an eye on what's going to happen to the market for the rest of the year. And Americans give out of disposable personal income. These are everyday households give out of disposable personal income. Again, this is something that's been anemic. It's been as high as 2.4% of DPI. In 2020, it was only 1.9% of DPI. So those are some of the macroeconomic factors that we look at. We also look at policy factors. Frankly, corporate giving is less than 1% of corporate pre-tax profits. And that's disappointing to many of us in the sector. That includes their in-kind giving. So corporate giving is the smallest piece of the charitable pie. I'm sure many of you, though, have some very generous corporate supporters. What can we do to encourage more corporations to participate in civil society in this way? The CARES Act provided a couple of incentives for charitable giving that are in place for the remainder of this year. So for the remainder of this year, an everyday household can deduct $300, $600 if filing jointly. Of course, the average giving from households that give is more than $1,000. So we don't think that really moves the needle. Maybe it stimulates some conversation. There are a few instances where donors will take advantage of another provision of the CARES Act that allows them to give 100% of their adjusted gross income and take a charitable deduction and pay no federal income tax. But that's a pretty extraordinary circumstance, and they need to work that out with their financial advisors. There are a lot of people who are working toward the optimal charitable deduction. Some work by the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University, which also researches in Rights Giving USA, looked at a variety of scenarios and found that a $4,000 individual deduction paired with an $8,000 filing jointly would have the greatest stimulus for charitable giving and the lowest impact on our treasury. So many of us are hoping for that day to come. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and invite my colleague Barb to come into the conversation. And I'm just curious, how does that national picture compare to what you experienced?
Yeah, so first of all, Laura, I'm just so fascinated by this data, and I really appreciate the great presentation. And then exactly what you've asked me, you kind of take all that, and my board might see this in the news, or they might be like, Barb, why aren't we getting $1 billion, gift from someone? And I'm sure somebody will, but. So we are Resolve, the National Infertility Association. We're a 501c3 patient advocacy organization. So like an American Cancer Society or American Heart Association, we're like that, but very small. We're about a $2 million organization. So as I was mentioning earlier, when I look at some of the health organizations that are also in our similar revenue space, generally, they're getting about 60 to 70% of their overall revenue from corporate support. And that's going to be from, a pharmaceutical company. I mean, you look at something like psoriasis. They have, which is actually a lot larger than Resolve, but they have a huge percentage of their revenue coming from pharmaceutical companies because there's so many in that space. So when I look at your data and then I look at kind of where we are, I last year was such an anomaly, and thank you for the big asterisk that I can now put on that, because I worry that going forward, when you look at trend data, boards are going to say, wait a minute, Barb, we're down, we're up, what happened? And so thank you for giving me permission to do that. But we're one of those organizations that had those fundraising walks, that had some of those in-person activities. We also have a very robust do-it-yourself fundraising program, and it includes walks and other things. And that obviously got hit super hard. So when I take all of our charitable giving for calendar year 2020 and compare it to calendar year 2019, it's down. It's down like 15%. But I want to play around with that. So I took out the two sources of funding that comes from those in-person walks, because I wanted to see, how did we do outside of that? We're actually up 16%.
Okay.
So we had just our giving in general, nothing to do with a walk or whatever, was way up from 2020 to 2019. So we do fit that in some respects to yours, but I always look at sort of like, okay, where are we now? If last year had the big asterisk, so I went to my team and I said, how are we doing this year right now compared to 2020? And we're pretty much on par, Laura, which I'm a little surprised at, because a lot of us, wait on year-end giving for those donors that give every single year. We also have a big fundraising event that's in November, and we get a lot of charitable giving from that. So it doesn't count. The data I just said doesn't compare to 2020. I only went through September. So I'm really hopeful that with our fundraiser and our year-end, that we might get close to where we were in 2020. But it's been tough. It's been tough, and I think you struggle with how much should we be asking. And I felt like last year all we did was ask. I don't know if that was right or wrong, but I felt like I didn't know if we were going to even have a year-end appeal, because I didn't know if the stock market would have crashed and the world would have ended. So I was like, we better ask them in July, So we did a lot of that. And I don't know if what you're seeing in regards to how people are acting, are they still acting in that mentality like they did in 2020, or do you see them kind of reverting back to the old familiar ways?
I'll answer that, but before I do, I'll remind our audience, and you're a small group, so let's make this a conversation. This is your chance. If you've got some questions, please put them in. Emily, do you want them in chat or Q&A?
Chat.
In the chat.
In the chat. So if you've got questions, put them in the chat, and we're happy to make this a broader conversation. Giving USA looks retrospectively at a year after it's ended. So we haven't really looked at 21 this year, but it's also, we say, an almanac that brings in a lot of other research. And there's a great piece of research called the Fundraising Effectiveness Project. And they work with a number of the data providers and really quarterly come out with what they think is happening in the marketplace. And I think that what we are seeing is, our friends at Indiana University will say any economic model tends to revert to the mean. And we are seeing that, we're coming closer to what we saw in 2019. I was heartened. The percentage of American households who give has declined steadily over the last couple of decades to more than 60% to now like 56%, which isn't good.
No.
But there's some evidence that in 2020, it was higher because those households who could give, they didn't have, they weren't going on vacation. There weren't other places to spend their money. And they recognize that I'm in a fortunate position. I'm grateful for what I have. I'm in a position where I can give. Because we know that it's not the same households that give every year. There's a cohort of households that give every year. And then there's a big, messy, dynamic middle where they give one year, but not the next. If we broaden our time horizon, those households, actually, it's more like a 70 or 80% of American households that give at some point over a 3, 4, 5 year period. And I think more of them tended to participate in 20. but that then speaks to our retention rates. And I think that's what's going to really influence 21. What's your experience right now with retention, donor retention, Barbara?
Well, so I looked at a couple things. I looked at our year-end appeal, our year-end fundraising in 2020, and kind of gauged how many of those donors had given before, and it was about 40%. So then I said, well, wait a minute, let's look at 21 compared to 2020, just again through September. And I wanted to know how many of the people who've donated to our organization in calendar year 21 are first-time donors, and how many have donated before. And again, this is only through September. And I keep saying that because a lot of us get our returning donors at the year end, at the calendar year end. So Laura, so far this year, 64% of our donors are first-time donors.
Wow.
So I'm like, so we're doing some things that are capturing people and getting them to respond and to donate. Of course, it's then our job to keep them and retain them. And then as I look at our year end, which, you know, we start that around middle of November. Some people start a little bit earlier. Our emails really start picking up, obviously, Giving Tuesday and then right through December 31st. So that cohort of donors tends to be people who've donated before. Even though we're doing a lot of external marketing to our entire community, they tend to be people who've donated before. And of course, our major donors tend to give it that year end as well. But go ahead.
Well, I think that there are a couple of headwinds, frankly, that you're experiencing. One is that first-time donors, that's the most fragile renewal. If you can get a donor to renew the first time, then they're sticky and they'll probably stay with you if you treat them right. So that's a headwind, is how do you inspire those first-time donors to give to you again? The other thing that we see is that if a donor comes to you through some sort of a peer-to-peer program, they were asked by a friend to donate, those are really hard donors to retain unless the friend asks them again next year.
Right.
So ensuring that friend has a tremendous experience in their peer-to-peer fundraising platform is also really important, because it's hard to convert them to donors without that friend serving as the intermediary. So the other thing I hear you saying, though, is that there's also research that says a donor who gives you $250 or more is much more likely to renew. That at that point, they're really making a philanthropic investment. They're being thoughtful about it. And so you mentioned earlier, I didn't know if I should ask or not. My encouragement to folks would be, it's all about tone, and it's all about also acknowledging what the donors have done in the past, but be bold and ask your donors to consider a gift of $250, even if they want to do that through some sort of a monthly or quarterly donation program, because that'll significantly increase, you know, and that churn of $60 donors at the end of the day is not really all that healthy for your organization.
Right.
You know, a lot of work to be done to go through that churn every year. If you could have a steady number of, I'd trade one $250 donor for 6 of those $60 donors.
Laura, you mentioned donor advised funds, and you even said, oh, this one of those categories included donor advised funds, or DAFs, as a lot of us talk about it. And you know, we get charitable donations from people through their donor advised funds, and it's a little bit of a mystery how we can proactively, what do we do with DAFs, and how do we as fundraisers think about DAFs? So what resources do you have for people like me that want to learn more and that want to understand this area? And you mentioned financial planners. I know a lot of financial planners are telling their clients about DAFs, and I think and they're so accessible. I mean, you can through Schwab or Fidelity. So help me understand where we can get some more information.
So, well, thank you for the question. And we'll talk about DAFs a little bit, but I'll also mention that the Giving USA Foundation is issuing a special report on donor advised funds. It will come out in November.
Oh,
and
great.
If you subscribe to Giving USA and get the full report, you'll also get any special reports that we publish. And we do a couple every year. Some have to do with things like registration requirements in the States. But we will be doing a special report in November, and it will have some more information on donor advised funds. A lot of it will be data driven, like the data that I just shared. But for the practitioner to understand, first of all, it cites some other reports that talk about why do donors set up a donor advised fund? Usually it has to do with some sort of what we like to call a sudden liquidity event, the sale of a business, an inheritance, cashing in stock options. And they know they want to do something charitable with that money, but heck, it's November and I don't want to have to give it all away yet this year and make those decisions. They can put it in a donor advised fund. That is an irrevocable charitable gift. Now, the only thing they can do with that money is give it to charity. So it's a pool of resources sitting there to fuel charitable giving. They can never get it back because they took a tax deduction when they made the gift. And now they can work with the donor advised fund sponsor, Schwab or Fidelity, their local community foundation, whoever it might be. And as an advisor, they can say, I would like to make a distribution of $1,000 to resolve. You get a check from Schwab or Fidelity or Vanguard or the Columbus Foundation for $1,000.
Mm-hmm.
So now you as an organization, a couple of things, hopefully, and in most cases, in the majority of cases, they will let you know who the donor, who the advisor was that directed this. You can thank the foundation if you want to. Frankly, they don't do a lot with those letters. Thank the donor.
Yeah.
Thank the donor, the person who directed the money to you. Make sure that they get an acknowledgement. That's important. And if you have a donor data management system, what we will see in most instances is that in the donor data management, you need to acknowledge the foundation as the donor for IRS purposes. They cut the check, but a soft credit to the advisor who directed that money to you, and then continue to retain that relationship. That's, that person has set aside resources for charitable giving. So you want to be very attentive to that relationship. Now, there is no magic list of all of the people who have donor advised funds, the hundreds of thousands, literally, at Fidelity, and tens of thousands at the other national DAF sponsors, and the many at the local community foundations. There's no list of those. And in many cases, the donors have done that to have a layer between them and the charitable world. So the first thing that you need to do is just good, basic fundraising and retaining relationships. Now, there are a few things you can do. There's something called a DAF Direct widget. So you can go to, I believe you go to DAF Direct, and you can get a widget and put it on your website.
We have
and
that.
People can press a button.
Mm-hmm.
And if they have a donor advised fund, they can just fill out the form right there to ask the donor advised fund to direct money to you, and it will heighten awareness. So go to, look at putting that DAF Direct widget on your website. You can also, on occasion, and I think this is more effective for a place-based charity than perhaps for a national association. But you can, for instance, here in Central Ohio, our community foundation has over $2 billion in assets. Much of that is in donor advised funds. They'll do occasionally donor education programs where they'll educate donor advised fund holders about opportunities to give. Work with them and, talk with them about why it might be appropriate for your organization to do that. Somebody like Fidelity does it as well, but understand that they're doing it nationally, and you're going to be competing with every other nonprofit organization nationally to be part of that donor education. So why should they pick you over all of the other worthy causes? Just be sure you have a good answer to that. And then the final thing I would say is many organizations work through financial advisors. You said financial advisors are encouraging those clients who are charitably inclined and have a reason to want to make a large infusion of charitable giving at a certain time, but spread it out, the gifts over time. That's what they're advising them to do. So do you have a professional advisors network? Do you have professional advisors on your board? Or do you have a council of professional advisors who then can also help you understand, who are the big movers and shakers? It's Fidelity is by far the largest, Schwab, Vanguard, National Philanthropic Trust, and some others. And then the local community foundation. So they can help give you some insights into that. But mostly a strategy for securing gifts from donor advised funds is really a major gift strategy.
Yeah, exactly.
Securing gifts from individual donors, because that's who's directing the funds your way.
Right. And we do have, I've heard this from other people saying, oh, I don't like getting, well, who wouldn't like getting a donation of a large size, but they say, oh, I don't know who the donor is. I think 100% of our DAF donations, we know who the donor is. And we've had the donor in our system. We've had one DAF gift where we were like, who is this person? and we didn't have necessarily a relationship, and so it was a little bit of digging around to try and connect, but for the most part, we know who they are. So, you know, a lot of folks, Laura, are trade associations or professional membership organizations, but yet they do want to do charitable giving and fundraising as well. Do you see any differences in how they should proceed forward with making asks and doing fundraising when they're also trying to get memberships and the like?
Mm-hmm. And we've worked with some national associations, professional associations, and of course, you know, and Benefactor Group is a consulting firm that I founded and lead, which works with nonprofit organizations to develop effective fundraising strategies. And then Giving Institute is our professional association. So we find ourselves in the same position. And a couple of things. One is, if your professional association is a 501c4 or 6 or some other kind of IRS designation, the first step is to consider whether or not you should create a 501c3 subsidiary foundation. Most corporations and foundations, for example, if they're going to be giving out of their charitable giving pot, they want it to go to a 501c3. So consider whether or not to have a 501c3. So that's number one. Number two, you know, there's been some research done on association giving. It's not real recent, and I'd love to see it updated, but it suggests that individuals who are members of associations make charitable gifts at a higher than average rate. They're more likely to be charitable than the average household.
Okay.
But they're not giving it to their association's cause. They're giving it everywhere else. So, you know, I fear that in many instances, we haven't made the case. And that's what I would do as well, is say, what kind of, it's not going to just go into our general operating budget. That will not be appealing in the least to a donor for money to go into your general operating budget. So what is it that we do that might inspire philanthropy? I know for many, it's providing fellowships or scholarships for early professionals to come to the educational conferences. For others, it might be for Giving Institute, it was research. And so the Giving USA Foundation really focuses on research in the charitable sector. So think about, is there something that would be particularly beneficial for us as a industry, but also appealing to our donors that they might want to support, and how can we make a strong case? And then it's a matter of, you know, that look at that 501c3 foundation you created, recruit a board, and make sure that that board understands that their focus is philanthropy.
Yeah.
That they're expected to be givers and askers. And so how can they, or at the very least, advocates. Barb, you might be real comfortable doing the asking as long as they're going to advocate for you. So, so I would say those are some of the things, because I think it is untapped potential, given that we know that the individuals who are members of your association are probably making generous contributions elsewhere.
Fantastic data, fantastic data. Emily, do we have any other questions that you want to throw out?
The only question, I think you sort of touched on this, is, you know, the difference between associations and charity nonprofits. Do you have any trends for association giving?
Like I said, the one report that we've seen is an older report, and so we don't really have good data-driven trends. I have some anecdotes, and I think that's where I share the thought about, when you build your case for support for gifts to your association, or more likely your association's foundation, making sure that you've picked one or two singular causes and you're articulating it as a cause. You know, understand there are a lot of worthy causes out there, a lot of worthy causes. And so you need to differentiate yourself from all of the other good worthy causes. And some of that has to do with picking a target for your fundraising that's very appealing to your donors, conveying that clearly in your messaging. And then there is one piece of data that we see, and when donors are asked, why is it that you never made a second gift to that organization? You know what the most common response is? I don't know what they did with my money. They never told me how they spent my money. Mm-hmm. That's pretty unfulfilling. And so make sure you're communicating back with those donors saying, hey, we were able to provide 15 fellowships for first-year professionals in our industry to come to our national conference, or we were able to help fund this piece of research into the causes of infertility that really seems to be moving the needle. So I think it's make sure that you do something great with the money and tell people about it.
And ask. Don't be afraid to ask. I mean, if there's one thing we've learned through the pandemic is get over the fear of asking and ask. And it really, quite honestly, it made a huge difference to our organization. And I'm feeling very bold this year after last year and want to ask even more. And so I think that would be my key takeaway from all the data that I'm seeing is, gosh, if the Giving USA data is saying that giving was up, that's incredible. So that just shows you that we have a lot of money that and a lot of contributions that are still out there for us to gather.
I can't imagine a better place to end than that. So Emily, why don't you take us all home?
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you both so much for spending the last 45 minutes with us, 42 to be exact, and presenting this information. It's just so valuable to know as people start looking towards year-end giving and 2022 giving. So yeah, I'm just really thankful to have you both with us. And thanks to everyone who joined us today and who will join us in the future watching the recording. I did want to point out this slide does have the contact information